Now, on Senate business, Mr. President Pro Tem, the Senate will have a busy week ahead of it. Today and tomorrow, the Senate will confirm 2 more members of President Biden's cabinet, Dr. Miguel Cardona to serve as Secretary of Education, and Governor Gina Raimondo to serve as Commerce Secretary. The Senate will also confirm Dr. Cecilia Rouse to serve as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, another history-making pick who will be the first black official to head that department. All 3 nominees are exceptionally well qualified. All have received bipartisan support in their respective committees, including a unanimous vote in favor of Dr. Rouse. As we continue the fight against the pandemic on all fronts, in particular the damage it has caused our schools and our economy, these nominees will have a difficult and important task ahead of them. It will be very good news once we have them confirmed and on the job. The Senate will then return to the American Rescue Plan, comprehensive legislation that will help us crush the virus, recover our economy, and get life back to normal. Defeating the pandemic is national priority number 1. Getting our schools to reopen as safely and quickly as possible, helping small businesses hang on until the economy can come roaring back, keeping teachers and firefighters and other essential employees on the job, providing aid to the jobless, food to the hungry, direct cash payments to millions of Americans struggling with the cost of rent, groceries, medicine, and utilities, speeding the distribution of the vaccine, which is the cornerstone to ending this awfully dark chapter in American history. That's what our country needs, and that's what the American Rescue Plan will achieve. To paraphrase Franklin Roosevelt, we must do the first things first. Last week, the legislation passed in the House of Representatives. This week, the Senate will take up the measure. Let me say that again. The Senate will take up the American Rescue Plan this week. I expect a hearty debate and some late nights, but the American people sent us here with a job to do to help the country through this moment of extraordinary challenge, to end, through action, the greatest health crisis our country has faced in a century. And that's just what we're going to do. Now, on another matter entirely, Madam President, voting rights. The story of American democracy is a long and messy one, full of contradictions and halting progress. It was a century and a half after our founding before women got the right to vote, another half century before African Americans could enjoy the full rights of citizenship. It took mighty movements, decades of fraught political conflicts to achieve even those basic dignities and establish the United States as a full democracy worthy of the title. But any American who thinks that today, in 2021, that fight is over, that the fight for voting rights is over, is sorely and unfortunately, sadly mistaken. In the wake of the most recent election, an election that the former president has repeatedly lied about and claimed was stolen, more than 253 bills in 43 states have been introduced to tighten voting rules under the pernicious, nasty guise of election integrity. In Iowa, the state legislature voted to cut early voting by 9 days. Polls will close an hour earlier. And they voted to tighten the rules on absentee voting, which so many, the elderly, the disabled, the frail, depend on. In Wisconsin, Republican lawmakers have proposed limiting ballot drop boxes to 1 per municipality. A municipality of hundreds of thousands and a tiny one get the small one. I wonder why. I wonder why. In Arizona, one Republican legislator wants to pass a law allowing the state legislators, listen to this, Madam President, to ignore the results of the presidential election and determine their own slate of electors. One legislator in Arizona wants to pass a law allowing state legislators to ignore the results of the presidential election and determine their own slate of electors. That doesn't sound like democracy. That sounds like dictatorship. The most reprehensible of all efforts might be found in Georgia, where Republicans have introduced a bill to eliminate all early voting on Sundays, a day when black churches sponsor get-out-the-vote drives known as Souls to the Polls. We have supposedly come a long way since African Americans in the South were forced to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to be allowed to vote. But it's very difficult to look at the specific laws proposed by Republican legislatures around the country designed to limit voter participation in heavily African American and Hispanic areas, to lower turnout and frustrate election administration in urban districts and near college campuses, to gerrymander the districts to limit minority representation with, quote, almost surgical precision, to specifically target and thwart black churches from organizing voting drives. It is difficult, very difficult, not to see the tentacles of America's generations-old caste system, typically associated with slavery and Jim Crow, stretching into the 21st century and poisoning the wellspring of any true democracy, free and fair elections. We see a lot of despicable things these days, but nothing seems to be more despicable than this. When you lose an election in a democratic society, you update your party platform and appeal to more voters. You don't change the rules to make it harder for your opponents to vote, especially not African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and other voters who have been historically disenfranchised. That response is toxic to democracy, and indeed is the very opposite of democracy. Make no mistake, these despicable, discriminatory, anti-democratic proposals are on the move in state legislatures throughout America. They must be opposed by every American, Democrat, Republican, Independent, liberal, conservative, moderate, who cherishes our democracy. This is just, it's incredible what they are trying to do. Incredible. We must do everything we can to stop it. I yield the floor. Yield the floor yet. Madam President, I understand there are two measures at the desk due for a second reading en bloc.
The leader is correct. The clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time.
S-461, a bill to create a point of order against legislation modifying the number of justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Senate Joint Resolution 9, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to require that the Supreme Court of the United States be composed of 9 judges.
Madam President,
Mr. Majority Leader.
in order to place the bills on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding en bloc.
Objection is heard. The bills will be placed on the calendar.
Yield the floor.
Madam President.
Mr. Republican Leader.
Once again, communities across my home state of Kentucky are enduring the aftermath of very severe weather. From east to west, heavy rains have drenched the Commonwealth. Sadly, some of the hardest hit areas were still in the midst of trying to recover from last month's dangerous ice and snow. Emergency crews, first responders, and now the Kentucky National Guard are continuing to work around the clock to prevent this bad situation from becoming entirely tragic. An entire nursing home in McGoffin County was evacuated as a safety precaution. A feet of water submerged vehicles and caused power outages in Callaway County. Wolfe County firefighters followed the light of a cell phone and saved the family of 5 who'd been trapped in their car. Once again, Kentucky's brave first responders are stepping up at a time of need. We're all grateful for their dedicated efforts and praying for their safety. All Kentuckians can help the first responders by continuing to follow the recommendations of local emergency personnel. So my team and I are closely monitoring the situation and we'll be ready to assist however we can. Now, another matter, at about 2 o'clock on Saturday morning, House Democrats rammed through the bonanza of partisan spending they're calling a pandemic rescue package. Only Democrats voted for it. Both Republicans and Democrats voted against it. Last year, under a Republican Senate and a Republican administration, Congress passed 5 historic coronavirus relief bills, 5 of them. Not one of the 5 bills got fewer than 90 votes in the Senate or less than about 80% over in the House. But alas, this time, Democrats have chosen to go a completely partisan route. Even famous liberal economists and liberal editorial boards are saying their half-baked plan is poorly targeted to what families need. So we've gone from passing COVID relief with 80% and 90% bipartisan supermajorities last year to the Speaker of the House ramming this through with just 50.7% of the House on Friday night. The bill contains all kinds of liberal spending on pet projects with no relationship whatsoever to pandemic relief. Now remember, we're almost to the 1-year anniversary of a leading House Democrat admitting they see this whole crisis as, quote, a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision, end quote. So, sorry to all the American families who've just been hoping to get their jobs back, their schools back, and their lives back. Democrats are more interested in some restructuring. That's why only 1%, Madam President, 1% of this huge package goes directly to vaccinations. 1% for vaccinations. That's why it proposes another 12-digit sum of federal funding for K through 12 schools, even though science tells us schools can be made safe right now. About 95% of that funding won't even go out this fiscal year. 95% of the school funding in this bill won't go out this year. And this is an emergency package. That's why they're pushing economic policies that would drag down our recovery. Like the House votes for a one-size-fits-all minimum wage policy that would kill 1.4 million jobs, or continuing to pay laid-off workers a premium to stay home that would extend well into a recovery where job growth and rehiring will be pivotal. Whenever their long-term liberal dreams come into conflict with what Americans actually need right now, Democrats decided their ideology should win out. Well, Madam President, it didn't have to be this way. We could have built more practical policies to help the American people move forward. Some Senate Republicans literally went down to the White House to propose that both sides work together like we did 5 times last year. The administration declined. So this is where we are, a bad process, a bad bill, and a missed opportunity to do right by working families. Now, one final matter. Last weekend brought disconcerting headlines for the supporters of freedom and democracy in Asia. In Burma, the military junta's month-long coup turned bloody. 18 protesters have been murdered, and at least 1,000 civilian officials have been imprisoned on farcical grounds. Over in Hong Kong, China's puppet regime arrested 47 democracy advocates, including some who helped draw millions to the streets in peaceful protests in 2019, and are now holding them without bail. Unfortunately, in both places, this sort of repression has become a familiar part of life, and it could be a dark review of developments elsewhere if the free world does not act. Even as Burma's civilian government made history in 2015, the military made clear it would keep using cronyism and constitutional manipulation to obstruct real popular control. In last year's election, the people overwhelmingly demanded true democracy and economic transparency. But that also raised the risk for those working publicly to make permanent reforms. The military's detention spree has hit Burma's civilian leaders, including people like Mia Ai, a longtime Muslim pro-democracy leader. It's also swept up some of the brightest economic reformers working to fight corruption and grow prosperity. Brave men like Bobo Nye, who spent years locked away in Burma's insane prison in the 1980s and 90s, built a successful life abroad and returned to help the civilian government craft economic reforms. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that this Washington Post article detailing his story be included at this point in the record.
Without objection.
Even foreign nationals have been subjected to unjustified detention. The world is closely watching the case of Sean Turnell, an Australian scholar who spent years helping Burma's civilian leaders unlock its economic potential. The administration has been right to confirm the junta and to condemn the junta and to consult with Congress on an appropriate response. But as Burma's protesters begin to pay the ultimate price for speaking out, the United States must make it clear that military and police officials will face crippling costs of their own. This should include the military-owned holding companies, which have deep roots in Burma's economy. It's time to lead an international effort to support the people of Burma. It's also time to strengthen our calls for an international response to China's shameless human rights abuses, beginning with Hong Kong. Another round of arrests in the last several days has sent a new wave of student activists to prison with no due process. They join veteran pro-democracy reformers like my friends Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai, who were already rounded up. The United States cannot outsource our moral authority in championing democracy around the world. When we stay silent, the voice of the international community is channeled through forums where the most notorious human rights abusers preside over their own trials. The ironically named UN Human Rights Council boasts a membership including such paragons of virtue as the Russian Federation, which has begun sentencing citizens to prison for non-state sanctioned religious beliefs. Oh, and Venezuela, whose rap sheet the State Department spells out as arbitrary detention, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. And Cuba, whose government exports repressive tools to countries like Venezuela. And of course, the People's Republic of China itself, where the hypocrisy stretches from repression in Hong Kong to internment and torture of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. The Biden administration has advertised a foreign policy focused on human rights and democracy, and quite publicly announced its intention to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council. Well, fine, let Burma and Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Belarus be tests of this administration's approach to the Council. But the White House must not put much trust in this corrupted institution. We should be uniting like-minded democracies around actions that the United Nations panels are either unwilling or unable to take. With respect to Hong Kong, the prior administration took several concrete steps, from closing PRC investment loopholes in Hong Kong to imposing targeted sanctions. Now is the time for the Biden administration to show its resolve as it confronts serious tests of its own.